Hey everybody, welcome to week 10. This is the last week before spring break. Yay. Um, so this week is called Tools of Analysis Part 3. And this week, I really want to talk about what um, Clemens and Macbeth call the non-rational or the political approach or approaches to policy analysis. A lot of what I'm going to show you in this slide is review. Um, but I have a slightly different spin on some of it. So um, bear with me. We will talk about policy in general, and then talk a little bit about um, evaluating alternatives, which is exactly what you have coming up, due on the 18th of March. Your part 3 of the policy analysis project, and so in that part, as you know, you will write your policy alternatives and your selection criteria. And so we're going to emphasize that a little bit more this week. We've already talked about it a lot, but I want to emphasize it more because this is really the heart of your project. So let's get right to that. Okay, so Clemens and Macbeth again. Um, I hope you're enjoying reading their book. It's slightly different read than some of the other things we've read. Um, they talk about their criticism of the rationalist model, what they call the criticism of the rationalist model. Um, so what are they talking about? Well, first of all, they note that the word politics and the word policy have the same root, which is polis. Of course, the ancient Greek city-state was known as the polis. But also that word refers to a body of citizens, and for us, it means that politics is the way we resolve disagreements about what we should be doing with our constituted governance, what our governments should be doing for us, perhaps to us, some people would say, really short of killing each other. And that's actually, I'm not saying that facetiously. You know, the 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 answer to our problems with each other as humans clearly is not killing each other, but we've resorted to that throughout our history. Um, but doing something short of that is preferable, right? So that's why we have political systems. And of course, the most efficient kind of political system, if you think about it, is probably an authoritarian dictatorship where the dictator or the monarch tells us all what to do. We don't have choices, and so we don't argue with each other. But of course, um, that negates human freedom and human choice and a lot of human dignity. And so we have to have a political system that allows us to discuss our grievances and our differences. Um, and so this leads to us asking, well, how do we do that? And you all took 80/50, and so you read Woodrow Wilson and his politics administration dichotomy. And so roughly what Wilson implies is that, the practice of politics as he defined it is somehow dirtied, through emotion, through deal making, through pressure from interest groups. But from this process, we elected leaders, and policies in Wilson's way of thinking are different than politics. Policies are what come out of this sullied political system that we have. So, even though that system itself has some flaws, it somehow creates policy that is clear and implementable. And then administration, we as public administrators, our part, again in Wilson's way of thinking, is that we are experts in the art and science of non-biased, neutral implementation of policy without these more unseemly aspects of politics. And so, a lot of policy analysis had been based on kind of this idea um, that policy is just neutral and we are neutral administrators. And so, what we should do is look for the most rational approach to implement policy. Now, you can decide if that's actually realistic or not. And so, what do we mean by the policy cycle? And you've seen this chart before, but I'd like to use this to sort of demonstrate what would happen if we lived in this Wilsonian kind of world. Um, so let's start with agenda setting. So in agenda setting, elected officials would set the agenda based on input they got from constituents. So in the perfect world, every elected representative would have perfect knowledge from his or her constituents, um, and that would enable them to come to the representative body and say, "Here's what my constituents want. I want to put it on the agenda." And so from that, then elected officials would formulate a workable policy design. They would, in their representative body, in the legislative body, they would hammer out the details of the policy that the constituents want, and they would formulate this very workable policy design. And then, of course, the policy has to be legitimated. Well, the way it's legitimate is that our representative democracy passes this legislation or this policy by a majority vote or whatever, or super majority, whatever the rule of the House is. Um, and so the policy is, by definition, a legitimate policy. And then here in the implementation step, this is really the first time that we as administrators actually see the policy or deal with the policy. We haven't had any input up to this point. And so we administrators use expert methods to carry out these clear orders that the elected officials have come up with in their policymaking. But of course, no policy is perfect, right? Even in spite of all that. And so we trained policy analysts. Um, we can use methods like cost benefit analysis to evaluate whether the policy achieves its purposes. And we may do that 1 year down the road, 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, but we're going to go back and we're going to apply some rational criteria to evaluating whether the policy has been successful. And then based on that evaluation, we go back to the elected officials with our report, and they will change the policy or maybe perhaps replace it with something else or throw it out altogether to make something that's more effective. And so in this perfect Wilsonian world, this is the way policy would work, right? But we know we have a sense it probably doesn't work that way. Um, and so you've seen this chart before too, but what this is related to is the perfectly rational policy making approach, the stages approach, as I just showed you, is related to this rational model of a decision system or a decision that you would make in your organization. And so what it's really based on is inputs and outputs. So the inputs are the resources that we need to make this purely rational decision. And so we can establish a complete set of operational weights and goals with weights, I should say, and we can establish the resources and the values that weigh on the decision. And then using that, we're going to prepare a complete set of predictions about each one. You know, we could project forward, we could use cost benefit analysis, and we could make a criteria for each option, calculate the net worth of each option, and then compare those net worths and come up with an output which is the most effective solution for our problem. But again, just like in politics, in an organization, uh, the decision making is not necessarily always rational. Though that doesn't mean, let me hasten to add this. Um, you know, I'm not criticizing the rational decision making model at all. Um, I think that Clemens and Macbeth might be, but I really think that this kind of a decision making model and the stages heuristic, as they call it, the policy making looked at in stages, at the very least, provides us a vocabulary for problem solving and for policy making. So keep that in mind. Even though politics is very confusing, um, these models provide us a vocabulary that becomes very useful when we start exploring more complicated models, as we're going to do right now. So you've seen this before, and maybe some of you have read his book, John Kingdon's 1984 book, and he revised it later in the 90s, I think 95. Um, so this is called the multiple streams model. And what you know is that Kingdon says that there's a three streams. Um, there's a problem stream, a policy stream, and a politics stream. And when these streams come together at some perfect time, there's a window of opportunity. And when that window of opportunity presents itself, a policy entrepreneur must quickly take advantage of that opportunity, get through the window and make a new policy or a policy reform. So, and so this makes changes in the subsystem. And this is when the coalitions are able to act. Okay, so what's some key elements of the advocacy coalition framework? So the first thing is that there is this external environment in which policy exists. Um, Consisting of these relatively stable parameters and sometimes external events. And you could say the external events really resemble what Kingdon was talking about. Sometimes it's a triggering event, sometimes it's just a slow change in public opinion on something. Sometimes it's a change in the way we do uh, government. Um, so changes actually energize coalitions. And so the second element is that policy does operate in a subsystem with many policy actors. And so the important thing to take away from ACF is that it's not just legislators or members of the executive who are policy actors. It's also lobbyists, interest groups. It's even people like journalists. It's people like us, administrators. So, so all of these people are part of this policy subsystem, and they're all policy actors. And all these policy actors tend to form coalitions based on their beliefs. Sabatier and Jenkins Smith define three kinds of beliefs: deep core beliefs, which are these deeply held beliefs about human nature, for example, policy core beliefs, which are fairly deeply held beliefs about policy, and then secondary beliefs, which are usually malleable, things that they might change their minds on or be willing to change their minds on in the process of negotiation. Um, and so these coalitions use various strategies to influence the shape of policy. Um, so what's the point of, oh, even looking at this? The point is that what Sabatier and Jenkins Smith are really saying is that unlike, the policy stages model, if policy could happen in these 5 or 6 stages in the Wilsonian world, they say that's not really realistic because what's really happening is all those stages are happening simultaneously. Somebody's always talking about um, policy reform of a certain policy while somebody else is implementing it, while somebody else is evaluating it. All these things are going on simultaneously, and all these actors are within a policy subsystem in which they're all trying to make change in one direction or another. Um, so the next theory I wanted to mention is closely related to Kingdon, and it's called punctuated equilibrium theory, which came along about the same time as ACF in around 1993. It's based on the work of Baumgartner and Jones and following works. Again, many hundreds of studies and work on punctuated equilibrium theory. But what Baumgartner and Jones posit is that most policy um, really proceeds in an incremental or equilibrium way. We don't change policy that much. Um, but when we change it in dramatic ways. And why is that? Um, what they say is that uh, policy doesn't change much because, frankly, legislators don't have time to worry about it. Um, they prefer to see policy just going along fine in an equilibrium manner, uh, However, they could increase attention to that, and when increased attention forces them to look at it, they may make a policy change, which would cause them to make a dramatic change, and that's going to lead to some new policy equilibrium. So this line here uses budget as a reflective measure of the policy. So in some equilibrium state, um, let's use Social Security as an example. Um, we know that the budget for Social Security increases over time, and it continues to increase over time. However, we looked at Social Security in class, and we know that there are any number of solutions in that CVO report. There were 30 plus um, solutions for various things that were wrong with Social Security, right? But none of those have been implemented really. And why is that? Because unless forced to do it, Congress doesn't really want to change Social Security. But at some point, there may be some forcing event that will cause Congress to change Social Security. And at that time, they may move to a new equilibrium. So imagine that they took up one of those solutions, which would be raising the income level at which you have to pay the payroll tax. So it's around $107,000 right now. What if they moved it up to $500,000? So your first $500,000 of income, you would pay payroll taxes into the Social Security fund. Um, and what if at the same time they said that Congress said that the only people that can get Social Security in the future will be means tested, meaning that mostly poor people will get Social Security and people over a certain income level won't be able to collect Social Security. So that would be a jarring change in Social Security, and it would cause a new policy equilibrium. But Baumgartner and Jones say uh, that happens only occasionally, and it is something like a punctuation. Literally, it's something like an earthquake. And so, what are some of the key elements of punctuated equilibrium? As I said, most policy operates in this equilibrium status, um, but there may be a focusing event or something causing a look at it. That might be just reports that say this policy is getting unsustainable because of the money we're spending on it. It might not change over time because of institutional friction, um, which prevents policy change. Institutional friction may be, the particular institution that uh, holds the policy isn't interested in policy change, or the Congress, its own friction, its own inertia, isn't interested in policy change. Um, Sometimes policy equilibrium is enforced by policy monopolies that work to control access to the agenda. Um, so think of Social Security again. The AARP is a very powerful lobby. The AARP is in no way interested in any kind of change to Social Security, and they have the ear of many members of Congress. Now, Baumgartner Jones write about some interesting policy monopolies that have been broken. One they write about in their 1993 book was nuclear power. Nuclear power started out in the late 1940s and early 1950s as a very hopeful kind of source of generating electrical power. In fact, one of the catchphrases for nuclear power was that it was so cheap that your electrical power that you got at your house didn't even need to be metered. There was no point in even charging you for it because it was so cheap. Well, this changed after many scientists began to say, hey, nuclear power isn't as clean necessarily and isn't necessarily as safe as you might think. And so in the early 70s, especially after a couple of nuclear power plant accidents, one in the Soviet Union at Chernobyl and one in the United States at Three Mile Island, the policy image really changed, and that policy monopoly lost uh, the ear of Congress. And so um, policy monopolies can be changed. Um, And sometimes policy change happens because of uh, what Baumgartner and Jones call venue seeking. So what is venue seeking? Um, Venue seeking is when advocates for change seek other avenues for policy change beyond legislatures, such as the courts, other levels of government, or public and media opinion. So, a great example of venue change is same sex marriage. Before the Supreme Court decision that allowed same sex marriage in all of the United States, advocates for same sex marriage were actually approaching the problem through state courts, federal courts, and state legislatures. And so what was happening was state by state, same sex marriage was becoming legal in a lot of states in the union. Sometimes that was through legislative efforts, sometimes it was through state court efforts. And so that is very common in areas where that's possible. Sometimes it's not possible. There are some pieces of legislation that are completely controlled by the federal government or completely controlled by state governments. So venues seeking doesn't work very well. So this is what Baumgartner and Jones say about policy. Um, so we talked about this before. We talked about Deborah Stone and narrative policy framework, which I really enjoyed that exercise that week. So really, I don't want to belabor that, but what now narrative policy framework says that coalitions do form, and they form around beliefs, as Sabatier and Jenkins Smith say, but sometimes those beliefs are expressed by narratives, and narratives are stories that people use to really define the problem. So, the question you have to ask sometimes is, are these narratives something like a marketing ploy? That a 64 ounce or 64 calorie beer really tastes great after you run, some kind of marketing ploy like that? Or um, do they really reflect beliefs about policy? And so finally, there's the Cobb and Elder, really way back in 1972, kind of came up with the definitive agenda setting model. And so you can see there's like 11 steps there in stages: stage one, stage two, stage three. Um, and what they're talking about is how policy goes from initiating a problem to actually writing policy for it. And so they say there's three stages. So before this, there was no issue. Way back in the 60s, there's a book called Silent Spring. And that book talked about the, the pesticide DDT, which was used on farms a lot. Uh, and the author of the book talked about how DDT was basically going to destroy um, all all insect life to the point where it would harm us, right? Because bees, pollinate apple trees. Without bees, we wouldn't have apple trees. Um, and this was really an impactful book. And before that book was written, really nobody talked about DDT that much. So the policy initiator interacts with some triggering device to help create an issue. And so at stage two, now we know there's an issue. So what happens now? Now advocates battle over problem definition and symbol utilization. So here you can kind of see narrative policy analysis going on, right? Or people constructing narratives to define the problem. They may come up with their group of heroes, victims, and villains. Remember those people from Stone's chapters and the exercise we did on that? And so they determine the scope or the size of the problem. And then these advocates compete to use their preferred definitions or perhaps their preferred narrative, to inform the media and the public. And so really there's this kind of public battle over whose narrative are you going to believe. And so now it gets to the point where it's put on the systematic agenda. And so now think of what Kingdon talked about. There may be a window of opportunity. Think about what Baumgartner and Jones talked about. There may be so much pressure on policymakers that they're just called upon to do something, anything about the policy. And so now it's a battle of where do advocates access policymakers? Is it at the state level, the court level? Um, is it at the Congress level? Um, and so ultimately the issue ends up with some institution or somebody with the power to act on it. And then finally, action is allocated. And I like that term from Cobb and Elder, allocated, because when you create a policy, it's not always the perfect solution in someone's mind, right? Action is allocated, policy action is allocated just like budget funds are allocated. Um, the solution that is finally arrived at might not be the full-blown solution that somebody wanted, but some part of a solution is allocated towards solving that problem. I throw this in here just at the very last because it relates to Cobb and Elder, and we talked about this before too, Hogwin and Peters, who said that most policy is not a brand new policy innovation. Most policy is policy succession. So really what's happening is we are layering uh, bits and pieces of new policy on bits and pieces of old policy. And so that kind of goes back to what Cobb and Elder are talking about with policy uh, allocation. So let's switch gears real quick right here. I should have had a transition slide that said I'm switching gears now. I apologize for that. I want to switch over to chapter 6. This, again, chapter 6, is kind of a rehash of what we've been talking about. We're writing a policy analysis, and we have parts to it. And so here's yet another 5-step model for policy analysis, but it's important to consider what Clemens and Macbeth are saying. So just for a couple of minutes, I want to talk about that. So they say there's 5 steps. Step 1 is defining the problem and determining causes. We've done that, right? We've defined a problem and determined causes. What I want you to take away from this is this chart that summarizes the chapter or part of the chapter, where they say basically the way you define a problem is going to help drive the solutions that you come up with, right? And so they use the example of drug abuse. If we say drug abuse is a result of the breakdown of institutions like the family, schools, the church, um, then we construct some policy that hopes to restore institutions, right? There was, and maybe there still is, a drive at one time to have children wear uniforms to school, because if they wear uniforms to school, then that helps instill some kind of sense of discipline and they'll be less apt to use drugs, right? Some Christian groups have said we need prayer in school. Um, this will bring back spirituality to public schools, and that would help people um, quit choosing to use drugs. Um, and then on the other side, probably a slightly more liberal approach would be, okay, what if we expanded family leave for workers so that mothers and fathers could spend more time with their children and thereby be positive role models? But what if we said drug abuse is the result of just an individual making a choice, like a cost benefit analysis? The drug of choice, for me, let's say I can make meth for a few bucks with just some, you know, with some uh, pseudoephedrine and Comet or something. And um, it doesn't cost me very much, and the buzz I get is worth a lot to me, right? At least for a while. Well, so we should say, well, we should make that cost benefit analysis more costly. We should increase the costs and decrease the benefits. And so how do we increase the costs? We increase the cost of drug use by things like mandatory sentencing for uh, possession or for distribution. Um, and so we try to cost this person out of the market. What if we say drug abuse is a learned behavior? Um, you know, my kids smoke marijuana because their friends did, for example. Well, so we try to destigmatize the drug use itself, and we try to provide education and counseling efforts to make to help people make better choices. Way back in the 1980s during the Reagan administration, First Lady Nancy Reagan's program was this very thing. And the campaign was called Just Say No. And so there were all kinds of advertisements on television and the radio and every billboards, things in schools that said, to high school kids and junior high kids, just say no to drugs. Just say no. That was the education effort. So what if we expanded this drug abuse problem and said, hey, look, yeah, use of cocaine is a problem, uh, use of heroin is a problem, but also use of legal substances like Oxycontin is a problem. And it's a problem because drug companies really kind of push it on doctors, and then doctors overprescribe it. So every time you have a headache, or I shouldn't say headache, but every time you have a shoulder ache or a backache, the doctor prescribes you, you know, a whole prescription of Flexerol or something. And so you you become addicted to it. Well, um, so perhaps a solution to that might be, nationalized drug companies, which would be seen as fairly radical. But what if you did things like eliminate drug advertisements? Well, eliminating advertisements was a policy solution that was carried out for cigarettes. At the same time that the USDA was subsidizing tobacco farmers, we, as a matter of national policy, outlawed uh, cigarette advertisements. So you used to be able to see cigarette advertisements on television and in magazines, and then it ended. And the thought was that if we don't advertise cigarettes, people won't smoke. Um, well, maybe that's true, but this just demonstrates the way you define a problem might might affect your policy solution set. So what's step two, according to Clemens and Macbeth? Step two is establishing criteria to evaluate alternatives, and they come up with several alternative or several ways, several criteria of evaluating. They talk about technical feasibility, economic feasibility, cost effectiveness, political viability, legality, and ethics. Okay, so here's my pitch. Read that section of the book. That's going to be part of our discussion this week, these very things right here. So keep that in mind and read that section of the book. Okay, step three, and this is coming up for us too, right? Generate policy alternatives. And they prescribe some ways of coming up with policy alternatives that are interesting. They talk about things like a best practices search. Our other text, the text by Bardak talks about a best practices search. If you're in a city and maybe you want to, as a way of an alternative, study 5 or 6 other cities who have the same problem with your policy area that you do, and ask what they do. Use of experts, right? So especially at the local level, experts are often called upon to help really formulate policy. But remember, experts also have values and biases, don't they? Um, the client orientation, and what they're really talking about here is, who do you work for on this policy analysis that you're doing? Are you working for the governor? Are you working for the mayor? Are you working for a member of Congress? What do they want? Um, they talk about brainstorming, and they're just talking about good old-fashioned brainstorming, where you get everybody in a room. There are no bad ideas. You write them all down, and then you evaluate them. But they're also talking here about getting stakeholders involved, which we've talked about. How do you involve stakeholders? The incremental approach. Maybe you want to tweak the system instead of trying to revolutionize it. Um, there you talk about using primary research. We've talked about this, right? How would you use a survey, for example, in your city to see if you need to build a new community center? And then do nothing. That's a solution. Doing nothing can be a solution. And then step 4 and 5, evaluate based on the criteria you established. And step 5, they say after you've adopted the policy, come back and evaluate it later on, which is actually really sound advice, because you don't just create policy and then walk away, do you? You have to go back and evaluate it. Now, one of the ways they talk about trying to evaluate your alternatives is through this thing they call the Geller scorecard. And here's one. This is right from page 178 of the book. So what this is doing is kind of giving you a way to evaluate things using those criteria we just talked about. One of them might be cost, right? Um, one of them might be political feasibility. One might be administrative feasibility. And so what they're saying is uh, that each one has a weight. So they're saying that cost is the most important weight. So they weighted at 3. They say political feasibility is the second most important, so they weighted at 2. Administrative feasibility is weighted at 1. Now, how did they come up with this? They came up with this uh, by, for example, getting input from the stakeholders. Um, and the stakeholders might be, uh, members of a committee. They might be the administrators. They might be members of the business community. They might be members of the nonprofit community that have an interest in this. There are a variety of stakeholders. Um, but when they weight it, then they take the actual cost. So this policy A is $50,000, policy B is $60,000, policy C is $35,000. So this means that this is uh, the most costly, so it's weighted at 3. Um, this is the best alternative. So I'm sorry, this is weighted at 1. This is weighted at 3. So this is the best alternative. So 3 times 3 is 9. The second one is 2 times 3 is 6. 1 times 3 is 3. So this one here has the most weight. But then they go through the other steps with this, using the weights. In the end, they decide that they have to decide between policy C and policy A. And so the point is they're not just choosing between cost alone, they're choosing other criteria, right? So that gets us to the discussion board for this week. So here's what I want you to do. I would like you to construct one of these Geller tables for your particular policy area. We've done already this past week, we used your policy area for the discussion. I'd like to keep doing that because honestly, my interest right now is having your mind focus on your policy area. And so this might provide you just one more way to help you think through your policy area. So I'd like you to construct a table, and what I'd like you to do is select at least 3 criteria you would use. There's more than 3 in the chapter. There's, technical feasibility, economic feasibility, cost, political viability, administrative viability, legality, and ethics. Select at least 3. Based on what you know right now, assign them weights. And then discuss what those criteria are and why you weighted them the way you did. And just so what I want you to do is write a couple paragraphs on what other criteria you would use in your table and why would one be weighted first, why would one be rated second, why would one be rated third, and just talk about your project and how you came up with those weights. And again, the intent of this is to help you actually, because on the 18th, you're going to be, providing alternatives and criteria. So hopefully this is one kind of last way to help you think through this. And so I want this to be the typical post question respond discussion with our typical due dates of Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. As a matter of fact, I want you to, now that we're at the last end of this this lecture, this just occurred to me. I'm gonna go ahead and cancel the Saturday thing. So present your Geller table by Tuesday, and then do offer critiques and questions to classmates by Thursday. But I want to give you a break on the Saturday thing because you have the other paper due on Saturday. So let me just do that, and that'll show up on the discussion board with a strike through on that part. So thanks for listening. I look forward to seeing your inputs. Thanks very much.